Hello. Prime Minister Modi has set India's ambition to become a developed country by 2047, or the 100th year of independence. Is it really possible for India to become a developed country in the next 23 to 25 years? I have with me Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao to make sense of this ambition. Dr. Subbarao is a distinguished economist, public policy expert, former Reserve Bank of India governor, and a former civil servant. Dr. Subbarao majored in physics from IIT Kanpur and then shifted to economics. He has an MS and a PhD in economics. He topped the IAS examination and joined the civil service in the early 70s. As the 22nd governor, Dr. Subbarao stayed the RBI during the global financial crisis of 2008. He authored two books, one on his days at the central bank and the other on his days in the bureaucracy. Dr. Subbarao's career reflects a commitment to public service, economic reform, and institutional integrity, making him a respected figure in India's financial and administrative landscape. The theme of this interview is India 2047, raising the game for a developed future. India is the fifth largest economy, and as per IMF World Economic Outlook, it is expected to overtake Japan and become the fourth largest. And recently, Niti Aayog CEO said India has already overtaken Japan.
That's right.
So the question is, how significant is this particular development, and is this a cause for much celebration?
Well, as you said, as of yesterday, we became the fourth largest economy in the world. So we are now behind the US, China, and Germany. And the expectations are that we will overtake Germany also in a couple of years from now. So we're a large economy. What is even more important than being a large economy is also that we are a fast-growing economy. Since the pandemic, we've clocked rapid growth. That is significant, of course, for us, but it is also significant for the world. I'll tell you why. There are economies which are smaller than India. They're growing more rapidly, like Vietnam and Ethiopia, but they're smaller than India. There are economies which are larger than India, like China, US, Germany, but they're growing slowly. So a large economy like India growing rapidly is a tantalizing prospect for the world because it adds to global demand. Today, India accounts for about 16 to 17% of global demand. So that is significant. You asked whether it's a cause for celebration. I would say it's a cause for cheer, not for celebration, because we're a large economy because of a large population. But a measure of how rich or how poor a country is per capita income. By per capita income standards, with a per capita income of $2,700, we rank about 137 or 138 in the League of Nations. So we're still a poor country. And the challenge for us is to reduce poverty. It is significant, of course, but I think that we have to focus on reducing poverty. Only then will be a cause for celebration.
So the Prime Minister a couple of years ago has spoken about a road to a developed nation. He calls it Viksit Bharat. Although there hasn't been any great program around or explanation about what is Viksit Bharat per se, but the World Bank estimates that we need to grow at a sustained fashion of about 8% every year. And do you think a sustained growth of 8% is possible for the next 23 to 25 years? Is it really possible? And do we have the ingredients to make that happen?
Yeah, first let me give you a background about where that 8% has come from. As we just spoke about, our per capita income today is about $2,700. The IMF yardstick norm for a rich country is per capita income of about $21,660, or let's say $22,000, which means that to become a rich country, our per capita income has to multiply eightfold. And if you take 22 years between today and 2047, you do simple arithmetic, you will get the number 8%. India has to clock growth of 8% on a clip for the next 22 years to reach the rich country status by 2047. The question is, can we do that? If you look at our growth trajectory over the last 35 plus years since the economic reforms, we've clocked growth of more than 8% 7 times. But we've never been able to maintain that growth of over 8% for more than 2 consecutive years. So maintaining a growth of 8% consistently, rapidly, is a tall task. And there are many things we have to do to grow at 8%. But what I want to say is that mere growth will not do. We need growth that will reduce inequality, which is growth where prosperity is widely shared. Inequalities are morally wrong, they're politically corrosive, but also bad economics. Because one of our growth drivers is our consumption. 800 million people at middle or less than middle income, if their incomes grow, they will consume more, they will spend more, that will lead to more production, more jobs, and higher growth. We can get onto a virtuous cycle. Therefore, it's in our interest. In order to keep our growth sustainable, we have to ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared. And the other thing we have to do, in order to ensure that benefits are widely shared, is to focus on job-creating growth. Because all along, they talk about whether this is a jobless growth. We need not get into that debate, but just look at the size of the problem. There's about 10 million people, at least about 10 million people joining the labor force every year. We're not even able to create half as many jobs. There's a backlog of about 50 million people, at least. And if agriculture productivity goes up as we want it to, more people will join the labor force. If female labor force participation rate improves as if we want it to, another 50 million join. So the jobs problem is enormous. So to become a rich country, mere growth will not do. We have to ensure that benefits of growth are widely shared, which means that we have to focus on reducing inequalities and creating jobs.
So if I may ask, at this point of time, what should be the strategy to get all this done, to ensure that the labor force part, the employment increases and we have a more equitable growth? From a policymaker's perspective, what should be the strategy?
Well, we've spoken about it. Two main things I have already said, which is reduce inequalities and focus on job creation. Now, reducing inequalities is a problem everywhere. It's a problem here as well. But it's not income inequalities alone that I'm talking about. I'm talking about inequality in a much wider sense that focus on education inequalities, health inequalities, because World Bank research shows that good quality education is the surefire way for upward mobility across generations. So we have to focus on education achievement, the quality of education. Again, health, morbidity indicators. Morbidity saps your ability to work and earn. So we've got to focus on health indicators. And jobs, of course, there is no magic formula, but I believe we have to focus on job-intensive sectors, particularly the SME sector, which is a feeder to the corporate sector, which is job-intensive. I believe we've got to focus more attention there.
So, Niti Aayog has mentioned that one of the biggest threats to we becoming a developed nation is this middle income trap of the middle income problem. How best can we avoid this?
Well, first some background on what is the middle income trap. Yeah. As countries they grow, development experience over the last 75 years shows that countries find it relatively easy to transit from low to middle income, but they find it exceedingly difficult to transit from middle income to high income. In other words, they get trapped in middle income, the middle income trap. Yeah. Why does that happen? That happens because we know from economics that as countries move up, they shift from agriculture to industry and then to services. Shifting from agriculture to industry is relatively easy because you're catching up with the latest technology. You're leapfrogging over several generations of technology. It unleashes enormous amount of production agriculture to industry, and you can move up to middle income. But moving up from middle income to high income requires innovation, requires that you be on the frontiers. And that many countries find it difficult. So low to middle income is possible because people are moving, wages go up, but once wages have gone up, to move from middle income to high income becomes difficult. So in short, low to middle income is catching up with the latest frontiers, and moving from middle income to high income is extending the frontiers. For that we need to focus on higher education, on an innovation culture. A simple example, just to give a flavor, DeepSeek, for example, came from China. Because China has been focusing on innovation. And India too, in our own support, we can say we landed on the moon last year at a much lower cost than NASA has ever done. So that's a testimonial to our innovation. We need to do much more of that to avoid the middle income trap.
All right. So coming about the recent episodes of growth, I think we've done a fairly good job of emerging out of the pandemic-related slowdown. Indian economy grew rapidly, but subsequently we do see that there are a fair amount of headwinds to growth. Do you think that these are cyclical headwinds, or do you think there seems to be something that needs to be done a little bit more structurally to aspire for at least 8% growth that everybody thinks is necessary for India to become a developed nation?
As you said, after the pandemic, we clocked rapid growth, but FY25 last year, growth had come down to around 6.5% or even lower, and this year also is expected to be around that. So there is concern that we've gone down from 8 or 7.5% to 6%. So there's a lot of debate, like you asked, whether this is a structural slowdown or cyclical slowdown, and opinion is divided. Those who argue that it is a cyclical slowdown say that there are lots of headwinds. There are global headwinds like geopolitical tensions, a global trade war. Then there are domestic headwinds like tight monetary policy by the RBI over the last 2 years to control inflation. But these headwinds are going to abate. We're going to get into a high growth stage once again because the government has been spending a lot on public investment over the last 4 years. That's going to yield dividends by way of kicking in private investment. In the last budget, the finance minister has given income tax concessions, which is going to boost consumption from low and middle classes. So because of all these factors, we will get through these headwinds and we'll get back onto a high growth trajectory. That's the cyclical argument. Those who argue that it is structural say that growth has actually been slowing down even before the pandemic. The catch-up growth is all over. The rapid growth that we saw over the last 4 years since the pandemic is just a rebound from the pandemic slowdown. But all growth drivers have ebbed. In the last 3-4 years, the growth has been driven almost entirely by government expenditure, but there are limits to how much the government can spend. Consumption is not going up. For example, for an economy that's growing at 7%, consumption is not even growing at 3 to 3.5%. So what does it say about inequality? So consumption is not going up. Private investment is not taking on. Private investment as a proportion of GDP has actually come down from about 20+% to 13% in 2024. So exports prospects are bleak. So where is your growth driver? No consumption, no investment, no exports, no government expenditure. What is your growth driver? This is the argument of the structuralists. My own view is that our growth slowdown is partly structural, partly cyclical, and we've got to attack both fronts.
So what can be done to improve growth from a structural perspective? How can we ensure this structurally our growth remains
Well,
intact?
these are, I wish I could say something original, but structural reforms, of course, we've been talking about it, about, easing the regulation, land reforms, labor reforms, taxation reforms. These are all important. But equally important is governance reforms. It's as we see it, our prime minister, chief ministers going abroad, canvassing for investment, inviting foreign investors to come and invest here. Chief ministers go also outside the states to invite domestic investors to come and invest here. But they got to walk the talk. It's one thing to promise something in Tokyo or London or New York or even in Mumbai or in Lucknow, but back in Hyderabad or Amaravati, are you walking the talk? That's important. Governance reforms, delivering on your promises is important. So to structurally get onto a higher growth trajectory, we need both structural reforms and governance reforms. And I hope the Deregulation Commission that the government has announced will work on these things.
So one criticism, probably mostly on the academic side, has been that somehow the government has been expecting the RBI to do bulk of the heavy lifting to support growth. But the fiscal policy has been somewhat more purist than what one would expect a monetary policy to be, a purist monetary policy. The government seems to be focused on doing capital expenditure and thinking that that would be enough. Do you think that's enough? That fiscal policy is very purist, but and the bulk of the heavy lifting is expected from the Reserve Bank of India?
On the contrary, I don't believe our fiscal policy is purist. The fiscal consolidation that the central government has shown and state governments must show, the commitment to fiscal prudence, I think is very much warranted, because we've had experience in our lived experience of the perils of year-on-year fiscal deficits. Just to recall the context, fiscal deficits, year-on-year fiscal deficits crowd out private investment because there is a limited pool of resources there. If government preempts a higher portion, there is that much less left for private investment, therefore interest rates go up. Fiscal deficits are also bad because year-on-year deficits add to debt, which adds to the interest payments. Interest payments are the largest single item of expenditure for the central government as well as for most state governments. And interest payments are the fastest growing item of expenditure for the central government and the state governments, which means that they're preempting other desirable expenditure. Fiscal deficits also fuel inflation. And fiscal deficits trigger balance of payments crisis, as we saw in 1991 and as we saw through a near crisis in 2013 during taper tantrums when I was governor. So for all these reasons, I think fiscal restraint is very much warranted. And people such as what you suggested, who argue that the government must spend more, are not looking at international trends. Our public expenditure as a proportion of GDP today is 28%. That is significantly higher than the share of public expenditure in China or Korea or Japan during their explosive growth years. So to believe that government must drive growth by spending more is misinformed. Yes, governments must spend more when, for example, there is demand depression, like in a Keynesian sort of situation, or governments must spend more on where they improve the quality of growth. But to believe on government spending for raising growth, I think is the government spending has a limited scope for raising growth.
There's a context to that question that I asked, in the sense that the magic bullet seems to be capex, but we've seen the limits to government capital expenditure given that the private sector hasn't really stepped up. One expectation was that given you mentioned about consumption weakening, so one expectation was that the government will step up revenue expenditure also, maybe spend more on health and other related expenses to boost consumption consumption demand. So do you think without government expenditure, consumption will automatically increase?
I should think so, because the way to raise consumption is to raise incomes of people. And raising incomes of people is not just transferring money to them, but providing them income earning opportunities. So government must focus not on the quantum of growth, but on the quality of growth. Where should they spend which will yield the largest dividend? For example, they spent on public investment over the last 4 years, much more than before, which is very welcome because infrastructure quality has gone up, quantity of infrastructure has gone up. The expectation was that will kick in private investment. That's not happened because capacity is, the underutilization of capacity so far. So government must focus on education, health, long-term growth triggers rather than focusing on income transfers.
So, I mean, you gave examples of Korea and also China. The other example that often people cite is that India's debt is not the kind of levels that, let's say, US and UK have seen at 80%. I think there is still some room, and then there are still others who would say that there is scope for the government to step up, even borrow more to ensure that we grow at a fast clip. What would you say to these people?
I've heard that argument before, and I disagree with that view that our debt to GDP ratio is low or within safe limits, and that we must increase, borrow more. Governments must borrow more and spend more. I disagree with that argument for several reasons. First, our governments are borrowing. When I say governments, I'm talking about the central government as well as state governments. They're borrowing money and spending it for current consumption at the margin because we have revenue deficits. So what does it mean? It means that at the margin we're borrowing money for current consumption. We know as households, as a society, as countries, that if we borrow money, that debt has to repay itself. It has to earn returns whereby you can repay the money. If you borrow money for current consumption, that's not going to happen. In fact, we're pushing the burden of debt repayment to our children. So there is a dharma angle, the ethical angle here, that should you borrow money and use it for your current consumption and pass on the debt burden to your children. So that is a cause for worry because debt can mount without providing in the future repayment capacity. The second thing people said, like you have, that look at Japan, Germany, look at not Germany, but look at the US, the UK, debt to GDP ratios are high. Our debt to GDP ratio at 80% looks very respectable, very safe in comparison. But I would say that international comparisons of debt to GDP are misleading because you must also look at the corresponding revenue to GDP levels. At 80%, India's revenue to GDP is relatively low. So we can get into a debt trap even at lower debt to GDP ratio. So we cannot compare ourselves to the US, UK, or Japan. In fact, as you must have seen over the last 3-4 days, there are a lot of anxiety, concern, not just in the US, but around the world about America actually debt to GDP going up, whether that's a cause for worry.
Correct.
The other reason I would say our debt to GDP ratio is worrying is because people argue that it's okay our governments are borrowing, but they're borrowing in rupees,
correct,
local currency, so we cannot have a debt problem because the government can always print money and repay.
Correct.
Okay? But that is suicidal because countries have come to grief by printing money and repaying debt. Okay? You can't inflate away your debt. And we have to behave responsibly because even if the government debt is in rupees, we depend on foreign investment. As long as we have a current account deficit, it means that we're depending on foreign savings coming into the country, and foreign savings will not come into the country if our public finance situation and more largely, our macroeconomic situation is not stable.
So I have one couple of questions on the Reserve Bank of India. It's been close to 10 years now that RBI has formally adopted an inflation targeting framework. And one criticism of the RBI has been that it has been excessively focused as a result on inflation, even at the expense of growth. Sometimes the anchor points within inflation have also changed. And there is an overbearing effort to ensure that inflation is brought down at all costs. So would you think that somewhere, this criticism that RBI has ignored growth is valid?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that criticism is wrong, because if you look at the inflation targeting framework that's been given to the RBI, or actually the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, it is to maintain price stability within the target band with keeping in view the concerns of growth. That clause is there in the Act, in the amended RBI Act. So keeping in view the clause concerns of growth. I believe over the last 9 years that we've been on this inflation targeting framework, the framework has delivered results, largely delivered results. Now, there is the view that RBI is focusing too much on inflation to the detriment of growth is not correct, because low and steady inflation, which is price stability, is a necessary condition for growth. Because for growth, you need consumption and investment. Consumers and investors cannot make informed decisions if there is no price stability. So I believe that price stability is a necessary condition for growth. And people also talk about it's complicated because the relationship between growth and inflation is non-linear. Okay, at low levels of inflation, inflation is actually supportive of growth. High levels of inflation actually hit growth. So we need to target that optimal level of inflation. I believe 4% has been arrived at after much research. That can be reviewed again. Another thing I want to say in the context of this criticism is that monetary policy can only raise growth to the potential level. If, for example, the potential growth rate of India today is 7.5%, we are actually growing at 6.5%. At best, Reserve Bank, through its monetary policy, can raise the growth rate from 6.5 to 7.5%. But raising the potential growth rate itself from 7.5% to 8% or 9% is the job of the government through its supportive fiscal policies and development policies. So to blame the RBI or to say that the RBI is too focused on inflation to the detriment of growth, I think is misinformed.
So a supplementary question is that the framework itself is coming up for a review next year. So what would you say are the key learnings from this particular framework so far?
Yeah.
And what changes can be made to the framework based on the experience that we have gained so far?
Yeah, first of all, I must say that the inflation targeting framework came after I left the RBI, so I don't have actual direct experience of that. But from my own understanding of the inflation situation and of the RBI, to make an informed review of the inflation targeting framework, I think we need to do more research. More research, for example, on the impact of the repo rate on inflation, the impact of the repo rate on inflation expectations. We need more research on the monetary policy transmission. I think it's a good time to start that research in order to feed into the review that's coming up next year. Also, I believe that there are certain changes that they must bring about, because our inflation management is done through monetary policy by two interest rates, the repo rate and the reverse repo rate. Both of them together constitute the interest rate framework for monetary policy in India, unlike some other advanced economies which have a single rate. The Monetary Policy Committee which is responsible for delivering on the inflation targeting, has a say only on the repo rate, not on the reverse repo rate. So that is an area for consideration. Second, there is the issue of exchange rate. Exchange rate is an important variable. Exchange rate affects inflation. Inflation affects exchange rate. But the MPC has a mandate only for inflation. So I think the mandate should be enlarged to say inflation on the target, keeping in view concerns of growth and external sector stability. The third thing I would say is that in monetary policy, there are two variables. One is the price of money, the other is the volume of money. The price of money is the interest rate. The volume of money is the liquidity, the stance. As of now, under the Act, the Monetary Policy Committee has a say only on the repo rate, a part of the interest rate determination, but no say on the stance. Although by convention and by tradition, the committee is determining or taking a stand on the stance, but under law they don't have it.
Correct.
So I think the law must be amended to make it clear that the MPC has control of repo and reverse repo, must keep in view the concerns of external sector stability, and must have a say also on the stance, on the volume of money in addition to the price of money.
So one supplementary question around this is that wouldn't the variables become too many in this case, that for the monetary policy to act on, given that, won't it lead to confusion in the sense that the monetary policy will also have a say on exchange rate, for instance? And won't it have an implication for the operations of the RBI when you're looking at the exchange rate movement and managing the volatility, as opposed to a monetary policy framework which has to be executed through the exchange rate?
You're absolutely right. That's a good question. But the alternative, I believe, is inferior to that. The alternative is the present situation. I'm not suggesting at all that the MPC must determine or sit in judgment on external sector management or RBI's intervention in the market, etc. That just is not feasible. Okay? I'm only saying that since inflation and exchange rate are interlinked, to give a mandate to the MPC that you deliver on inflation irrespective of the exchange rate situation, there's a risk that they will decide on a policy stance that will deliver inflation, that will be too focused on inflation to the exclusion of other concerns that you just spoke about. So I'm only saying that whenever the MPC meets, as long as they're considering what they should do in order to deliver on the inflation targeting framework, they should keep in view not just the concerns of growth, but also of the external sector situation. I believe that will contribute to long-term stability as well as a harmonious relationship between the MPC and the RBI as an institution.
Okay. So one more, I don't know, it may be a smaller question in the context of the framework. What about the inflation, measurement of inflation itself, given that there have been way too many suggestions that probably the recent episodes of inflation have been driven by food prices.
Right.
And monetary policy doesn't control food prices, so directly at least. So to that extent, there was a recommendation, a suggestion that the MPC should not look at food inflation. So from an anchor or a target perspective, what would your opinion be on these suggestions?
I've heard that argument before, but I don't believe that is advisable. We have what it is, like a poor country where consumption is a large component of the consumption. Food is a large component of the consumption basket, and food prices matter. People's inflation expectations are shaped by the food prices they experience in the market. For the Reserve Bank of India to say that we're going to target on an esoteric variable that is quite delinked from people's inflation experiences, I think is wrong. So I believe that the RBI must continue to focus on headline inflation, and the fact that food prices are variable is one of the challenges of inflation management, and to manage that challenge is not to take it away from the equation, but to keep it in the equation and manage it.
So you spoke about the exchange rate, and one criticism of the RBI in the recent past has been the management of the exchange rate. So much so that the former chief economic advisor wrote an article saying that RBI was the RBI pegging the rupee to the dollar. And we've seen this episode where the exchange rate was held steady, probably by the Reserve Bank of India, and then suddenly it was let go. So there has been a lot of concern about what exactly was happening with regard to the exchange rate. Probably this was 6-7 months ago. The debate was quite intense. What would you say that RBI should have done, or how should one look at the communication strategies around the exchange rate? The template answer has been, probably it stood well in the test of time, that RBI only looks at volatility and nothing else. But this particular episode, when the exchange rate was really held steady, that has led to a lot of confusion. So what could have happened according to you, and what advice would you give to those who are managing?
No, I would not give any advice, but just to say that whatever the RBI does with regard to exchange rate, it is always criticized. So that is the bottom line, okay? But let's look at what happened over the last 2 years, which is that the dollar strengthened continuously over the last 2 years. The rupee should have been allowed to depreciate, but the RBI held it steady, and the rupee was overvalued in real terms. And over the last 6 months, they have allowed it to find its market level. In my own view, the RBI as an institution is more interventionist than is warranted. The stated policy of the Reserve Bank, as you've just said, is that they do not target a specific exchange rate or an exchange rate band. Their job is only to control volatility. But I think RBI historically has failed to walk the talk. They have intervened, and every time it is reverse interpretation of, okay, the RBI has intervened, therefore there must have been volatility. Because what is volatility has never been defined. Even a one-way movement of the rupee has been treated as volatile. So I think there's a strong case for the RBI to be less interventionist than it is institutionally prone. Not just because we need to hold a lot of reserves which are costly, but because it is distortionary. Intervention by the RBI is distortionary of the markets. We want to be a developed country. If we want to be a developed country, we need mature markets, which means that we need our market participants to be able to adjust to two-way movement of the exchange rate. If every time the exchange rate moves and the markets are confident that the RBI will intervene and stabilize the exchange rate or keep it steady, they will never learn to manage the exchange rate. And in fact, the bigger risk is that they will outsource risk management to the RBI. So I believe there's a strong case for the RBI to be less interventionist. Of course, it must reduce volatility. It must not change the trajectory of movement, but it must soften, smoothen the trajectory of movement, not change the trajectory itself. So I believe there is, like you said, a communication challenge. RBI must walk the talk and communicate as clearly as possible about what their stance on the exchange rate has been.
So in fact, if I may add this, in one of the monetary policy statements in the address by the governor, he did list out that reserve accumulation was one of the strategy or the tactic that was being followed, given that it would help to save from the rainy day. My next question is, given the level of reserves that we have, do you think the external sector at this point of time is quite stable? Given the experience that we've had with taper tantrums or even with the lemon crisis, at this point of time, new crises are brewing every day. So, how do you look at the our exchange rate, our dynamic of our exchange rate policy or the external sector in particular?
Now, first of all, we need to have reserves, sufficient amount of reserves to inspire confidence within the country, around the world, that India can manage its exchange rate. But there are limits to that because there is a cost to holding reserves. So as much as we are looking at the benefit of holding reserves, we also must look at the cost of holding reserves. So I think we need to take a more pragmatic view. To believe that we have insulated ourselves against all future crises is wrong. As we've seen from our own experience, we are in a globalized world. Despite all that Trump is doing, we will continue to be in a globalized world. It's a financially globalized world. Whatever happens around the world impacts us. Take, for example, the Silicon Valley Bank that happened in March 2024 or sometime. Right? A small provincial bank in one state of the US, some ripples, some tremors there ricocheted around the world, which shows that whatever happens impacts us. So we must be on our guard, and I don't believe that we can ever be complacent saying that we have insulated ourselves against all crises, especially a country like India where we depend on the world for investment, where we depend on the world for exports. I think we've got to be on our guard.
But we, in the context of what has happened during the taper tantrums or global financial crisis, would you say that the position is not as bad, or even given that the new crises are brewing every day, how would you place us at this point of time?
See, we have higher level of reserves as compared to our GDP, as compared to our international position, as compared to short-term debt plus debt maturing within 1 year. The normal metrics, we have a robust amount of reserves. But as they say, any amount of reserves looks like too much in good times, and no amount of reserves looks like it's good enough in bad times. So to believe that just because we have reserves, we have protected ourselves against all sorts of assaults is wrong. Okay? I mean, we've learned from our own experience, we've learned from textbooks of Kindleberger, etc., and mania, panics, etc. So we've got to be on our guard.
So one burning question has been they were taper tantrums, now there is tariff tantrums. So how should India play this? And what are the implications for India with, this FTA discussions are ongoing, but how do you see this? How do you read this situation? And what should India's response be?
That's a very challenging question because it is a very, very fluid situation. Trump tariffs have been a masterclass in chaotic policy making, flip-flops, U-turns, one announcement, backtracking on that. So lots of things have happened over the last 3 months. When, if at all, we will ever reach an equilibrium is very uncertain. There are just too many moving parts. But as you said, India, I believe, we see from media reports that is actively negotiating an FTA with the US. That is very good. If we get a good FTA that protects our interests, as well as we have to give something to the US, we can't get anything without reciprocally giving something to the US, but if it's a reasonable good deal, if it's seen as a good deal, I think that'll be a good thing. But that does not mean that we have no negative implications. Okay? If it happens by the autumn, by August to September, that's good. But in the short term especially, there are negative consequences of Trump tariffs in the US, around the world. Take the US for example. His tariffs plus his recent tax cuts higher fiscal deficits, deportation of illegal immigrants. All this is going to raise inflation, sap consumer confidence in the US. US consumption will go down. Investor confidence will go down in the US, investment will go down. US exports will be hit because there will be retaliatory effect. Okay? So the US, I won't know if it's a recession, but certainly will slow down. The US exceptionalism will not be there. China, the other large economy, is also bound to slow down because of all this fluidity that's happening. If two large superpowers, super economies in the world slow down, it will impact us, both by way of our exports and our investment. Then there is the concern that China, because of excess capacity, will start dumping, which will hit our private investment. So on exports, on investment, we will be hit. Of course, there are short-term positives, such as, for example, Chinese goods coming in will reduce the inflation pressures. RBI will probably have some headroom for controlling interest rate, cutting interest rates and supporting growth, but these are in the short term. So I would say that it would be good if we get the FTA, but there will be short-term negative implications because of what's going to happen around the world. In the medium to long term, I believe we can turn this into an opportunity, both by way of trade and by way of investment. Countries around the world are looking for alternate members of the value chain, the global value chains, which China has been the hub. If they're going to look for alternatives, India would be well positioned. And we should look at that investment opportunity as a China plus one, but we must get our act together, which means that we must get our FTA not just with the US, but with the EU as well, with the UK we've signed, with some other large blocs. We must enter into a multilateral trade agreement. We must reduce tariffs across the board, improve governance that we talked about earlier. So we must exploit the opportunity that's going to be thrown up by countries looking for an alternative to China, both for investment and for trade.
Thank you, sir. Now move to one subject that you've looked at closely, which is state government finances. The context of my earlier question with regard to this fiscal policy being a little bit more purist than monetary policy, there's also one more big contrast, is that there seems to be a fair bit of fiscal discipline being shown by the central government, and there are a lot of people who say that probably the government is really looking for a ratings upgrade, and that's why it's been very focused on this glide path for fiscal consolidation, and then focusing on quality of its expenditure in the form of capex. But on the other hand, the state government finances are been a challenge. And investors and rating agencies look at a consolidated view. So to that extent, do you think that the center and states are going in different direction with regard to the fiscal policies?
To some extent, I would say that. Like you said, the central government over the last 3-4 years, or indeed even for longer, has shown some credible commitment to fiscal consolidation. They've also cleaned up their books, so there is more transparency now. There are no hidden expenditures, hidden debt. So to that extent, central government has moved forward. But state governments, I'm afraid, have not moved forward as much. In fact, some states have actually regressed. We must remember that India is one large fiscal entity, and our rating agencies look at not just the central government, but look at the center and states put together, because fiscal profligacy or fiscal misdirection in any one state can spill over into the entire system. So rating agencies are quite right about focusing on the entire fiscal system, and I believe that there must be more focus on fiscal consolidation and fiscal responsibility at the state level. After all, if you look at this, there is the 60-40 picture that I talk about. If you look at the combined tax revenue collection of the center and states put together, the center collects about 60% of the combined revenue, and states collect 40% of the revenue. I'm giving you some ballpark numbers. But if you look at the combined expenditure, states spend as much as 60% of total expenditure. Center gets to spend only 40%, which is that center collects 40% of taxes, spends only 60%. States collect only 40% of the revenue, but get to spend as much as 60%. So the fiscal stance of the states collectively matters for our overall fiscal stability and for our overall macroeconomic stability.
So there's also states seem to be in some sort of a competition between each other for freebies. You've also spoken about it recently. How can these be reined in? Is there some mechanism which can come in? I don't know how and what forum, but how can these be reined in? And is this getting out of hand?
I think it is getting out of hand. There is competitive populism because it's the job of political parties to win elections. They promise, and people go for that, and there is assault on public finances. But just as a preface, let me say that in a low-income country like ours, where millions, hundreds of millions struggle for daily livelihood, it's imperative that government, both at the center and in states, gives some transfer payments. They're not only necessary but desirable, but they've got to be within limits. Why? Precisely because of the reason that we discussed earlier. These freebies at the margin are not being financed or funded by earnings. They're being funded by borrowing. It is like a household borrowing money to party or to go on a vacation or to perform a wedding. Okay? How do you repay that? So the fiscal situation in states is like that. Freebies are being funded out of borrowing, therefore we've got to be more responsible, more restrained about it. Also, is this the best way of spending money? For example, just let's take one example, like you're giving free bus rides to women, which I believe is desirable. A lot of people say that. But have we ever said, okay, is this better to give free bus rides to women, or is it better to spend on girls' education? So we've not done that. So it's important that, like Mao said, should you give a fish to a person every day, or should you teach her to fish? I think we must focus on teaching people to fish rather than giving them a fish. But the substance of your question is what can restrain this? People have talked about the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank can't do it. The Reserve Bank is just a debt manager. They can't restrain state governments, which are sovereign. People have talked about the Election Commission. Election Commission cannot do it. Even if they can at best do it just before election, during the election campaign period, say that you disclose the financial implications of whatever you're promising. That the Election Commission can do, but it has no control over a government that is once elected. Okay? People talk about the CAG, but the CAG audit by definition is post-mortem. The CAG comes into the picture much after the sin has been committed. So there are no formal restraining mechanisms. Can the central government control the states? I think there is too much of political polarization in the country today for that to happen. The central government, the only mechanism it has is that when it gives permission to states to borrow, it can impose conditions. It is under the Constitution, it is refrained from doing so, and quite well advisedly, because there will be too many politics. So the way I see it, the solution to it, as I see, is for a political consensus to form. And for this, the central government must take the lead. No political party will do it by itself. Even a dominant political party like BJP will not do it. So the central government must take the lead, get all the state governments into the picture and develop a consensus. Just 2 days ago, we had the Niti Aayog meeting, all the state governments together, but I've seen a few media reports. I don't believe this issue has come up for discussion at all, but I believe it is a very important issue, and it is something to be decided, a consensus to be managed by the central government and state governments across political parties agreeing on a code of conduct.
So do you think, by extension, the Finance Commission can look at this? So can the terms of reference be broadened to address this particular issue?
Technically, it's possible. But the Finance Commission is a political body, and this is a quintessentially political issue. To believe that a political body can solve a political issue is, in a democracy as vigorous as ours, is misdirected. So this is a consensus that has to come politically, and that's how we should try to address the problem.
So you recently gave a speech and where you've challenged this notion that fiscal federalism is inherently loaded against the state governments. Can you explain that, sir?
The standard, the more common view of people, the larger public who have only a peripheral exposure to our fiscal federalism, is that states are shortchanged in fiscal federalism. All the taxation powers are with the center, all the expenditure control is with the center. States have no autonomy at all. I believe that is misinformed. Several illustrations, several evidences I can give you. First, for example, that the 60-40 that I talked about. States control as much as 60% of the combined expenditure. Political clout in a democracy comes from expenditure. So states in India are able to spend a higher proportion, whereby they get a higher political clout. And this proportion, 60%, is higher than in most other large federal countries such as Australia, Canada, or the US. Second, states have a much greater autonomy today on where they spend that money. Earlier there was a planning commission, the state plans, central plans, which used to dictate where states must spend the planned funds, how they must spend on what schemes. Today planning commission is gone. So states have larger autonomy. They have larger share of resources coming from the center, larger autonomy on that. States can also borrow. And as I said, even though the center can impose conditions, the center has refrained from imposing conditions. So states are today able to borrow, and they're able to borrow at a cost lower than they would command on their own basis, because there is a market assumption, although it is incorrect, that the central government is guaranteeing these loans. The central government is not guaranteeing, but there is an impression that the center is guaranteeing. Therefore, states are able to borrow at a lower rate. So whereas in most other countries, states are not even allowed to borrow. For example, in the US, states have to balance their budgets. They can only borrow for specific projects. Whereas in India, states are able to borrow and have freedom on where to spend the borrowed resources, including on freebies. So I believe states in India have a much greater freedom, much larger share of resources, much greater freedom on how to spend that money. So this notion that there is the center-state fiscal federalism is biased against the states is misdirected. Let me also cite this GST before I forget. One of the standard arguments of states is that with the introduction of GST, they lost their sovereignty, they've lost their right to impose taxes, raise or lower taxes. That is true to some extent. But it's not just the states alone which have lost sovereignty, if that's a loss of sovereignty. Even the central government has lost. Because GST rates are today set by the GST Council, where states and the center are represented. So for the states to believe that they have lost out sovereignty is incorrect. I believe the GST is a good proposal. GST project is good for the center and states, and for every state, I believe it's a good project.
So one more question that the other side seems to be that is there some way the central government can actually exert some mechanism, some pressure to ensure that states do control what they're spending monies on?
So the only mechanism, constitutional or statutory mechanism available to the central government is the power to restrict states' borrowing under Article 292, I believe, of the Constitution, which says that the states need the permission of the central government to borrow money from the market as long as they're indebted to the center. And states in India are going to be indebted to the center for the next 50 years. So the center is going to have control over states can borrow, and the Constitution also allows the center to impose some conditions while giving that permission to borrow. And the center, as I said earlier, has across government, not just this government, but across governments, historically refrained from using that power to impose conditions for the simple reason that politics will come into play, especially today when politics are highly polarized. So I believe as much as the center has limited powers, center does not have enough powers to control states, and the only organ that can control states is the people. And people have to be well informed, because ultimately the people who elect is the people to which accountability has to be rendered. So the way to enhance fiscal responsibility is to improve awareness. That's why I keep saying that there is a strong case for disseminating budgets in language that people understand, not in hardbound volumes, in numbers, technical language, but in language that people understand. Spread awareness about public finance issues so that people understand and can make informed decisions.
So you mentioned this, but increasingly there seems to be a problem between a great divide between some of the state governments in the south and the central government. There is this language issue which is brewing, and then of course the fiscal federalism aspect has been constantly being challenged. What is the way out of this? Is this actually becoming a bigger problem than what it ideally should have been?
I think so. The issue is becoming bigger. There are several fault lines you mentioned about central resource transfers. There is the issue of language. There is the issue of delimitation, which will come about.
Correct, sir.
There has been, in the last few months, issue of the powers of the governor and the powers of the governor to restrain the state government, etc. So a lot of fault lines, and these fault lines have become polarized because of intensified because of political polarization. But at a broad park level, if you see over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a slow north-south divide developing. Southern states have done well on growth, on investment, on infrastructure, on social indicators, on health and education, on governance, on rule of law. So there is a divide building up. Then there is the issue of central transfers to states. In federalism, it is appropriate and even desirable that there be some cross-subsidization from richer states to poorer states. For example, today, if southern states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, for every rupee they contribute to the central tax pool, they get back less than a rupee. Whereas states like Bihar, UP, for every rupee they contribute to the central pool, they get back more than a rupee. So this is cross-subsidization from richer states to poorer states. That is inevitable and even necessary in a federal state. But the question today is, are we hitting the limits of that cross-subsidization? Superimpose on that the impending delimitation, which should happen after the next census as per the current law. If that happens, southern states will lose proportional representation in the parliament. So this will be a double whammy. that they have to continue to subsidize poorer states, whereas they lose political clout. Is that correct? And on that are the governors' powers and language issue. We need to resolve this, and it requires much more than political leadership. It requires statesmanship, not just at the central level, but at the center and states.
So can they be Viksit Bharat without we addressing this particular issue of center-state relationships?
I believe that will be difficult. It's very appropriate that the Prime Minister has spoken about the center and states getting together for Viksit Bharat in the Niti Aayog meeting. Several chief ministers from the media reports I saw have spoken about their plans for their own states. All this is good, but we need to translate that into action. But in terms of Viksit Bharat, it is very, very important that we cannot get to a developed country status unless the center and states act in synergy, act in total coordination. People talk about the first generation reforms after 1991. The first generation reforms were in like trade, finance, investment, areas which were entirely within the domain of the central government. The central government could push through those reforms without consulting the states. But the second generation reforms that are necessary today for getting to a higher growth rate, to move towards Viksit Bharat, we need reforms in factor markets, land, labor, taxation, foreign investment, where not just the cooperation but even the consent of states is necessary. So the center and states must act in concert, must act in synergy if we have to get to Viksit Bharat.
Sir, your concluding thoughts on this idea of Viksit Bharat is just merely targeting growth enough? Can we get there with just this? What needs to be done?
No, mere growth will certainly not do it. We need to target on growth. We talked about it. We need to, the growth rate target, the 8% or whatever, to get to a rich country status. But a developed country is much more than a rich country. Yes, you need to be rich. You need to get a high per capita income, the standard of a rich country. But every rich country is not a developed country. Saudi Arabia, for example, is a rich country, but nobody would call Saudi Arabia a developed country. The distinction between a rich country and a developed country is institutions. Institutions of governance. Several people talk about it. Economists have won Nobel Prizes for saying this, that you need institutions for becoming a developed country. Mere growth, mere high income will not do. And I want to invoke Francis Fukuyama, who says that developed societies need a high quality of life for their citizens. And a high quality of life has to rest on three pillars: a rule of law, strong state, and accountable governance. Rule of law does not mean that, just tyranny. Rule of law means that laws apply to everybody equally. It also means that whoever breaks the law will get caught and be punished. And the state itself will not invoke law to tyrannize people. You need a strong state to enforce the rule of law. And you need accountable governance to ensure that the government does not get out of the way. And accountable governance, not just having elections every 5 years, periodically. Accountable governance is accounting to the people in between elections. We don't have proper mechanisms for that. So I believe that we need to be Viksit Bharat. We need not just be a rich country, we need to be a developed country, and we need to focus not just on growth, but on institutions of governance.
Dr. Subbarao Garu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Kalyan. Thanks so much.